4 years after he stole the lives of 17 students and staff at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, the state will likely spare the life of Nicholas Cruz, who pled guilty to the murders last year. A few days back, the jury voted 9-3 for the death penalty, but a 2016 Florida law requires a unanimous vote to impose capital punishment, so the jury recommended the judge sentence Cruz to life in prison without the possibility of parole instead. The decision was met with outrage from many, including the parents of many of the children Cruz executed.
I sent my daughter to school, and she was shot 8 times. I am so beyond disappointed and frustrated with this outcome.
And so I reject it completely. He is an evil person with no redeemable value and no purpose left on earth.
But not everyone in their position feels the same way, as we know from experience here in Boston. Back in 2015, the parents of Martin Richard, the youngest victim of the marathon bombings, urged the Department of Justice to drop the death penalty for Jahar Tsarnaev in a Boston Globe op-ed, citing the anguish they relived each time his sentence would be appealed. Overall, much of the country is split on the issue of the death penalty, a debate renewed by the jury's decision in Florida. I'm joined by Tony Montalto, whose daughter Gina was shot and killed in the Parkland shooting. He now leads the group called Stand with Parkland. And James Rooney, president of Massachusetts Citizens Against the Death Penalty, whose cousin died in the 9/11 terror attacks and whose brother was hit and killed by a driver while he was riding a bike. The driver was not criminally charged. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. And Tony, I am truly sorry for the loss of your daughter.
Thank you very much.
Tony, I watched, my radio colleague, Marjory and I watched the sentencing live on TV while we were live on the radio, and we could see the pain on the faces of so many of the families, particularly yours, I should say. What was your reaction when you heard the verdict, the sentence verdict being read?
Well, we were shocked, angered, frustrated, and confused. It's very difficult to understand how the jury came back and said that each individual aggravator was proven by the state beyond a reasonable doubt, yet somehow they found a mitigating circumstance in the shooter's life to excuse the attack on my daughter, her 13 classmates, and her 3 teachers. They call it a mitigator. That's just a fancy word for an excuse. And it's very incongruous that they would find, again, all the aggravating factors to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, yet find something in the shooter's life that justified that murder.
You know, Tony, the sense I got, well, I did read the comments of one of the parents from Parkland who did not support the death penalty. Am I right in saying that the vast majority of parents felt the way you did?
Yes, the vast majority of parents wanted this admitted murderer to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. And as a society, we should want him punished to the fullest extent of the law in order to discourage others that would think about attacking our nation's future by going into a school, attacking our most vulnerable students and teachers. I think that we need as much deterrence for that as possible. And that's why Stand with Parkland has worked to change many laws to help prevent this so no other family has to get to this point.
James, you don't agree that the death penalty is an appropriate sentence even for someone who's done something as atrocious as what Cruz did. Why?
Well, first of all, Mr. Montalto, as with everybody else I know, is terribly sorry for your loss and the loss that everybody at Parkland suffered. I think that if you're looking at this in terms of the death penalty helping victims, I think it's a false hope. The idea that sentencing someone to death is going to help the victims heal, I don't think is true. And I don't think in practice, in most situations, even in a lot of death penalty cases, the verdict doesn't come back as a death sentence. In the general realm of death penalty cases in state court, 1 out of 4 cases involving the death penalty comes back with a death sentence. It's about 1 out of 3 in the case of the federal system. But you can have situations like mine in which my cousin was killed in 9/11. Think of how long ago that is. Nobody's been tried for that. We know that the federal government has the chief perpetrator in Guantanamo, but that, who knows when that ever will happen.
So,
And
James, if there was a trial, if one of the people in the planes, for example, had survived, you would not. You would not. No, I'm asking you just to understand where you're coming from. You would not want to see them put to death.
The trouble with a terror incident, I think people will think, "Oh my God, this is some of the worst things that happened. You killed not just one, two, but tens. In the case of 9/11, thousands of people." But the whole point of these things, from the perspective of the terrorists, is the death itself, and they were perfectly willing to die. That's why they all died in 9/11. They were willing to sacrifice themselves, and most of the mass shootings involve people who are essentially suicidal. Many of them kill themselves at the scene, and many others are shot to death by the police. So a trial in one of these mass atrocities is rare.
You know, Tony,
it's not.
If I can, let me return to Tony, though, if I can, for a second. James, you know, the argument that I have to say, and I should be candid with you, I'm not a supporter of the death penalty, and for a variety of reasons, including if something horrible happened to me, like happened to you and your family, I'd like to see the maximum amount of suffering. I know you haven't said that, and I'd like to see someone wake up every day knowing that they would never be free from the box they woke up in. But you mentioned deterrence as the top reason. Do you believe there's evidence that suggests that someone like Cruz, who is hell-bent on killing people for no reason, would be stopped because he heard that a prior Cruz had gotten the death sentence?
First of all, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop using his name.
Sure.
We have worked with the federal government to come up with the school safety report, which came out in 2018. In there, there's a chapter that called No Notoriety. And we'd appreciate if all media would stop using the names of these mass murderers, because that gives them what they want. It gives them the notoriety. Sadly, today, we still see people paying homage and remembering the Columbine shooters. So we have to start reducing the notoriety of these shooters.
Totally fair point. Totally fair point.
To address your other point,
yeah,
I think that the more that we show how heinous this crime is and how it will be punished, it may not be the shooter himself or herself, but it will be those who hear about what they're planning to do. And we've worked with the U.S. Secret Service and the National Threat Assessment Center, and we know that in most cases, there is leakage about what's going to happen. So people should know that the best way to stop this is to report it. And I believe that as a deterrent, again, as a society, we should want anyone who commits a heinous crime, such as attacking our schools, to be punished to the maximum extent of the law. Here in Florida, that's the death penalty.
James, what's your response to what Tony just had to say about the deterrent effect?
Well, I agree with most of it. I agree with him that you look around and you see mass killings. The person who gets remembered out of the mass killings tends to be the shooter. The names of the victims go by the wayside, and you have people years later following in the footsteps of some of these killers. We should do everything we can to avoid doing that. It's hard to see how we can do it. It's hard to say how the news media can report on these sort of things without discussing the killer at some length. But it's something we need to focus on.
But let me be clear, if I may, just for a second, Tony, just so that there's some instruction. You're not suggesting or argue that we shouldn't talk about the shooter as long as we talk about his or her victims. You're suggesting using his name or her name, his name in virtually all cases, is the trigger that we should avoid. Is that not correct?
That is what you should definitely avoid. And you should always remember the victims. I mean, sadly, how did we get to this verdict? Because the court handcuffed the families on what we could do to help remember our victims. We were able to give victim impact statements, and then the jury was instructed not to give them any weight during the deliberation. We weren't allowed to bring pictures of our children or our spouses into the courtroom to represent them. Yet we had to look at almost every picture in every school setting of the shooter. They managed to turn him into a sympathetic figure, whereas the country needs to start remembering not everyone's a victim. A victim looks like this beautiful young girl over my shoulder. That's a victim, a person who did all the right things, who actually saved a life, who just got up one morning and went to school, and yet was gunned down in a heinous and atrocious way and never returned to her loving family.
You know, James, I'm sure you know, and I'm sure Tony knows too, that the support for the death penalty in this country peaked in the 90s, somewhere in the 80% range, according to the Gallup poll, and now it's into the low 50s. What do you attribute that to, James?
There are a number of things that are going on. Partly, I think the rise in the support for the death penalty came after a long-standing rise in crime. Certainly when I was a DA in Brooklyn in the 80s, there was a lot of crime and a lot of murders, and you're going to see support for the death penalty rise. As the crime level dropped, that has helped to drop the support for the death penalty. I think the other thing is partly the work of the Northwestern Journalism School and Hugo Bedot, the late professor from Tufts, who was able to find what I think surprised a lot of us, that there were a good deal of evidence that innocent people had been executed over time in the United States, and that was the sort of thing that you just want to absolutely avoid.
You know, on that note, Tony, if I may, there was no doubt who the killer was in this circumstance. But on this set where I'm sitting, I've had men who have spent up to 40 years in jail for murder. We don't have the death penalty in Massachusetts. Even based on eyewitness testimony, who it turned out didn't commit the crime. Does the potential for a mistake concern you?
Well, I'll say that that's why there's numerous appeals, why we should be careful in the application of the death penalty, and why we should, again, be fair, but fairness goes both ways. The victims have to be remembered. It's not fair to the victims. And the hypotheticals that people feel when they have to deal with the death penalty, I can tell you, they sure change when you're directly affected.
Well, you are directly affected. Could you spend the last minute telling us about Gina, for those of us who didn't know her?
Gina was our firstborn. She was a fantastic kid. Her smile and her laughter filled the room. She was bright and bubbly. She was kind and compassionate. She knew right from wrong. She was often the first one to go up to a new kid in the school and introduce herself and invite them to be friends. She was a wonderful daughter and a fantastic big sister to her brother, Anthony. I think that sadly, too often we forget who a victim is, what a victim is, and look at how the system failed my daughter, Gina, as opposed to some of the hypothetical failures that people feel.
Well, she sounds like an amazing kid, and you sound like a pretty amazing father. Tony, it's good to meet you. James, thanks for your time as well. Appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.